Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. My guest today is veteran writer Howell Raines, author of the novel Whiskey Man and several volumes of memoir. In his retirement from full-time journalism, Raines has found the time to complete his study of an important but largely unknown Alabama cavalry unit that fought for the Union Army. I spoke with Howell Raines in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Howell, it is nice to see you again.
Thank you, Don. We've known each other for many years.
Before we take another step, congratulations on induction into the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame last year. That was a wonderful ceremony and well-deserved.
Thank you very much. It was indeed an impressive ceremony, and I was lucky enough to bring my grandchildren, including my grandson Jasper Raines, who was the researcher on my new book.
Well, your son, Ben, has been on this program.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It wouldn't shock me very much if down the road Jasper were
Well,
too.
I hope it's going to be a third generation. He seems to have the bit in his teeth now.
It looks like it. I get into quarrels in printed materials, radio, television, prizes. Who's actually eligible for an Alabama prize? Who's a real Alabamian? Well, you are.
I am.
And you may have been raised in Birmingham, but your roots are solidly in the North. Loosely, to set us up for the whole business of the Civil War, you have your planters and you have your Appalachian mountain folk.
The Appalachian foothills all the way from North Carolina to northern Alabama and northern Georgia and Tennessee were highlands that were not conducive to plantation-type agriculture. Therefore, the subsistence farmers didn't own slaves. In addition, they were Jacksonian Democrats, and they believed in Andrew Jackson's 1840 dictum that the Union was too sacred to be torn apart over a sectional issue, even slavery. So that's why you had these 22 to 26 counties in the Alabama highlands from Birmingham all the way up to the Tennessee line that were anti-secession. And they sent anti-secession delegates to the secession convention in Montgomery in January of 1861.
And that vote, as Chris McElwain has described this at some very, very eloquent length, the decision to secede, later understood as practically unanimous, but at the time not.
Yeah. One of the central lies of the Lost Cause is that the white support in the South was monolithic.
Yeah.
And it was not even so devout a lost causer as Marie Bankhead Owen, the longtime director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History, conceded that at least half the white people of Alabama did not support secession.
Right.
That's why William Lowndes Yancey, the Confederate fire eater, wouldn't allow it to come to a popular vote. They would have lost.
There's a nuance in this that over the years I've slowly learned about Southern history. And the nuance may be even those people who admit it was not unanimous at the time of the voting, their premise is that right after the act of secession, everybody got on board.
Yeah.
Myth 2, in a sense.
Yeah, it's probably myth 1 sub A. After Fort Sumter was fired upon in the spring of 1861, there was a surge of defensiveness in the South. And even Tennessee, which did have a statewide referendum and voted to stay in the Union, even they went back and became secessionists. But that secession fever dissipated by 1862 in April, when the Battle of Shiloh showed everyone in the South that the Yankees were not pushovers.
There are these famous lines in Gone with the Wind. But I will get back to the Tarleton twins anon.
Bad boys.
but the idea that they'll all be back by Christmas, or
Yeah.
the Yankees won't fight.
There was a famous Alabama politician who said, we can beat them with pop guns. After the war, he was asked about it. He said, unfortunately, they decided to use rifles. But let me frame this in a big picture way. What this story reminds us is that history is not what happens, it's what gets written down. And what gets written down is controlled by politicians and the controlling institutions of the majority culture, colleges, churches, libraries. And that's every serious historian knows that history is not what's written down, but it's not a truth they share often with the general public. Therefore, we're constantly saying history will record this or history will say that. And as the novelist of the great Elizabethan novel, Wolf Hall, said,
Oh, yeah.
history is the way we organize our ignorance of the past. And I was stunned to find out in 25 years of dinner parties in Washington and New York, among highly literate, well-read people, that none had ever heard that there were Union soldiers from Alabama.
I had no notion of that when I lived in the North, but neither did people here, for that matter.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about, this is not a chronological sequence necessarily, but there are a couple of things I want to get established. And one is, when the war began, the counties north of Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, am I right that they were Unionist in large measure? They also thought they were going to be able to stay out of it. They would just mind their own business.
Right.
And as I read your book and other things, I see the Confederate draft as a very, very important moment. Made everything different.
It made everything different. This was the Confederate Conscription Act of 1862.
Yeah.
Was passed because after the first year of the war, all the plantation sons who wanted to go to the war had gone. And everybody else, not just in the mountains, but common people throughout the South, were saying, we don't want to fight for the slave master's right to own human beings. So that was a defining moment, that draft law. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is that my father, who was born in 1907, learned from his grandfather, who died in 1926, that in the last year of the war, when he turned 16, he fled on the instructions of his father to the Tennessee River and joined the Union Army, because they said there's no use fighting and dying for a lost cause.
When people talk about the Civil War, depending on their sophistication, they talk about the North against the South, or they refer to it as a brothers' war, but maybe in Kansas and in North Alabama, it was ferociously local.
It was.
I had no idea of the bloodthirsty intensity of what was going on in those counties.
And again, this gets back to the secession convention, where William Lowndes Yancey was outraged that 24 of the 100 delegates to that convention refused to sign the Ordinance of Secession that passed on January 11th, 1861. That enraged Yancey and the governor of Alabama, and that's when they started sending conscription squads into North Alabama to hunt down or kill draft resistors. And that was what sparked the Union movement in North Alabama.
Shorter? Is it
John Gill Shorter.
Shorter
Owned a plantation at Eufaula.
And you suggest, I think, rhetorically something like, Shorter did not express any great dismay about summary executions, or something euphemistic to that effect.
No, he in fact ordered Colonel Jemison of Tuscaloosa, the famous Jemison family of Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, to take he authorized him to take troops into Winston County and do anything necessary, including killing Christopher Sheets, the renegade Unionist from their point of view, who started the anti-war movement in Alabama.
A moment for Sheets and Looney's Tavern.
Isn't that a great story?
What happens there?
Chris Sheets was a 21-year-old school teacher in Winston County. He had gone to Somerville Academy, which was a pretty good prep school in North Alabama. General Longstreet went there as a young man to prepare for West Point. Sheets goes for a year or two there, comes home, becomes a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Winston County, begins talking up unionism around the country stores. When the delegate election is held on December 24th, 1860, he defeats the most important and one of the few slave owners in Winston County by a 5-to-1 margin. And that was when Montgomery, that was when their radar fired up. We've got a problem in North Alabama. And Sheets comes home. He's a chased man after a while. He starts working the back roads in what we would today call neighborhood organizing. Sometime in early 1862, legend has it was July 4th, but Donald Dodd, the best historian of Winston County, thinks it was sometime after Shiloh when white Alabamians said, we don't want any part of this war, at least North Alabamians. Chris Sheets calls a meeting at Looney's Tavern, which was owned by William the Black Fox Looney, who became a famous organizer of Union volunteers. And he gives a speech there saying that if Alabama can secede from the Union, Winston County can secede from Alabama. At that point, a famous local wit shouts in ridicule, "Hoo hoo, the free state of Winston." He meant it as a joke. That was Uncle Dick Payne, a famous Confederate soldier in his own right, but it stuck, the free state of Winston.
It still does.
It still does.
People still say it.
It's painted on barns up there. And so Sheets, by this time, is a hunted man. And eventually he's arrested and put in prison by Governor Shorter in October of 1862. But by that time, he had started enough people through the woods along the dirt roads and old Native American trails that converge on Huntsville. And this is a part of the war that was decisive in Confederate defeat that not even many Confederate history buffs know about. In April of 1862, General Ormsby Mitchell, Old Stars Mitchell, a astronomy professor from the University of Cincinnati, he's been put in charge of Nashville, which was the first Confederate capital to fall. He realizes the road to Huntsville, Alabama, 120 miles or so, is wide open. He marches 4,000 or 5,000 troops down. The residents of Huntsville awaken on that April morning to hear Yankee Doodle being played by his regimental band in the main street. That was a wound to the heart of the Confederacy from which it never recovered. By July, there were so many Unionists from Winston County and the surrounding 22 counties in Huntsville that General Don Carlos Buell, with the wonderful name, gets permission from Lincoln to organize the Alabama Volunteers into their own company. And that was the birth of the first Alabama Cavalry USA, which, as I say in my book, was effectively erased from Alabama history by the Alabama Department of Archives and History.
What you've uncovered and found in bits and pieces in 100 different places is what they actually did.
Yeah.
I love it that they helped burn Atlanta, burn Savannah, and lay waste to Georgia in between.
They didn't burn Savannah. They spared Savannah because there was so much cotton and the Yankees needed to. And then they went to Columbia, South Carolina and burned it, Sherman said, by accident. Atlanta they burned on purpose.
The activities of the first Alabama Cavalry USA, they were famous for spying and fighting.
That's right.
The spying is interesting because I don't have a mental picture of what, I mean, I think of Vienna.
Oh, the Spy Master's
That
town.
kind of thing, you know. But it's not. It's horseback.
And this is a fascinating thing, and this is how circumstances converge.
Mm-hmm.
These 2,000 farm boys, for the most part, from North Alabama, suddenly in contact with the major players of the Civil War. And Lincoln knows about them. Grant knows about them. Sherman learns about them. They fought Nathan Bedford Forrest often. So they were plunged with virtually no training into serious combat. General Grenville Dodge, later the builder of the Union Pacific Railroad, was a natural-born fighter and spy master, even though he was a civilian politician, but he was one of Lincoln's favorite political generals. He organized a Grant spy force which stretched from New Orleans to the Carolinas, about 100 agents, and 22 of those 100 agents were pulled in from the ranks of the 1st Alabama Cavalry. So they were right at the center of Civil War action virtually from the start. Sherman hears about them and asks that they be assigned to his personal command as his bodyguards and his companions on the march to the sea. They proved so effective as cavalrymen that he put these 5,000 cavalrymen, including the 800 surviving members of the 1st Alabama, they rode point from Atlanta to Savannah, did such a good job that the famous General Francis P. Blair, another Lincoln intimate, gave them the place of honor leading the victory parade through Savannah in Christmas week of 1864.
The Union needed the port as well.
I'm sorry?
The Union needed the port of Savannah.
They needed the port of Savannah. That's why they spared it.
There is, a few weeks ago, I was having a chat with Wayne Flint. Everybody, you know Wayne.
Who's quoted in my book.
Yeah, and he said, pay special attention to Sherman just outside Savannah when it is discovered that the Confederates have left behind landmines or what were called then torpedoes.
Yeah.
Sherman was outraged. This was not playing fair.
No, exactly.
This man has left a swath of destruction for 100 of miles.
Yeah.
But his ethics were outraged.
Well, he believed in the kind of the honorable code of Napoleonic warfare, and I have to confess this: the landmine was invented by a Confederate general named Gabriel Raines, no relation.
Okay.
But they mined that road into Savannah, and the 1st Alabama Cavalry was going down it, and one of their lieutenants' horse stepped on a mine and blew the lieutenant's leg off.
Yeah.
Sherman came to this young man, ministered to him in the dirt of that road, and was so infuriated he said, bring all the Confederate prisoners of war forward. He marched them down in front of his army and told them, you people may dig up the mines or step on them. It's your choice.
I'd never heard anything like it.
It's an amazing story, but again, this is another example. The 1st Alabama Cavalry is at this key moment of the war with the most important Union general of the moment, and they don't show up in the Alabama history books.
No, using prisoners of war to explode landmines.
Well,
it's
Sherman invented modern warfare in this sense. He and Grant decided that the plantation masters of the South and Jefferson Davis would never submit, no matter how many of their people died. So they said, we are going to so destroy the infrastructure of civilian Georgia and the rest of the South that the public will demand an end to the war, and that's what happened.
Yes, yes. You have uncovered what the 1st Cavalry of Alabama, USA, did. You have also uncovered the ways in which the world was kept from knowing what they did. Your villains. The first, I have a list of your villains.
Let's run through them. I love them.
Well, academics are far more important here than anybody would ever guess. William Archibald Dunning at Columbia, and then Walter Linwood Fleming at the, what I think here is the axis of evil, Vanderbilt and Swanee. They, as an old academic myself, I think this is a testimony to how damned important academic historians and academic literary critics can actually be.
Yeah, indeed. And let's focus on these two people. William Archibald Dunning was the most important historian of the first 20 years of the 20th century, not only because he invented a pro-Confederate view of Civil War and Reconstruction, because he regarded Southern aristocrats as a refined class of people who were not as evil as they had been depicted and who were unduly punished after the Civil War during Reconstruction.
Yeah.
He was born in New Jersey from a family that had sent soldiers to the Union Army, but his father, a New Jersey industrialist who lived in Plainfield, New Jersey and made carriages and was also an artist, quite a good painter, he conceived that the Southern plantation owners were his peers in that they were business people with a labor problem. And he raised William Archibald Dunning to be sympathetic for the plantation class. Dunning gets kicked out of Princeton for misbehavior, goes to Columbia. By 1885, he has his PhD, and by 1900, he is the leading figure in the first generation of trained American historians. In his 20-year reign at Columbia, as a friend of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and a lion of Manhattan society, he trains a new generation of young Southerners in the pro-Confederate view of history. They then spread out across the 7 major universities in the South.
Yes.
And they turn the Southern history departments, principally Vanderbilt, into lost cause citadels.
Yes.
It's an amazing story. Walter Linwood Fleming was born on a plantation in South Alabama, a minor plantation. He actually picked cotton as a young man. He went to Auburn and got his graduate degree under a very sophisticated historian there who trained at Johns Hopkins. He becomes the protege of Thomas McAdory Owen, the founder of the Alabama Department of Archives and History, who dispatches him to New York City. And I found in the Alabama archives correspondence among Thomas McAdory Owen, Walter Linwood Fleming, then in his 20s, and William Archibald Dunning, then the kingpin of American historians, talking about making the American History Association, the umbrella group, more friendly to the South.
When is there any excuse here on the grounds of ignorance? Did they know that what they were saying was not so, or were they deluded themselves? Because in the very next chapter, so to speak, historical, not necessarily your book, you get people like Marie
Bankhead
Owen, and she seems to be willfully destroying bits of history that she does, or documents that she doesn't like.
She does.
And willfully exaggerating the ones that she does like. How does ignorance and willfulness play in here with all of this?
Purposeful ignorance is probably a better, because if you don't want something to go in history, you can falsify or lie about it, or you can simply ignore it.
Yes.
Thomas McAdory Owen founded the Alabama Archives in 1900. He ran it until 1920. He was a pretty rigorous keeper of records and so forth, but he made a fundamental decision. The Alabama Department of Archives would be a Confederate archive. They would ignore the history of black Alabamians, both during and after slavery, and they would ignore Unionist Alabamians, or the North Alabama Unionist faction. So that this, from the beginning, that's the core reason none of the major Civil War historians like Bruce Catton have told this story, because the original records from Alabama were confined in a pro-Confederate way. When Marie Bankhead Owen gets in, she is the society editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. She's head of the United Daughters of Confederacy. She's head of the Alabama Librarian Association. She was called the Tiger Woman in Montgomery. She reigned from 1920, when her husband died and she succeeded him, until 1956. And she turned it into a kind of what the Birmingham Southern historian Virginia Vanderbilt Hamilton called Grandma's Attic. It was clipping and junk and not organized in any way. Yeah. The Brookings Institute came down and took a look at it in the 30s on the contract with the state of Alabama and said that it should be put out of business. It was such a wreck. She continued because of her political influence as the daughter of the Bankhead family.
Well, the power of the academics or the professors who made new PhDs and seeded them, and then added to that the power of inclusion and exclusion at the archives, creates the great myth, the lost cause.
Yeah. Let me say,
but a number of people here seem to be either deluded or happily or willfully deluded. Here in town, Stanley Hoole and Hudson Strode, Shelby Foote and Ken Burns, William Alexander Percy and Walker. There isn't time to unravel it all.
There is. And let me say, in Ken Burns'
thing here.
defense, Shelby Foote tricked him into omitting the 1st Alabama Cavalry from his great documentary, The Civil War.
Yeah.
If the 1st Alabama had been included in Ken Burns' 1990 film, the most powerful educational instrument in modern Civil War history, the 1st Alabama Cavalry would be as famous as the 54th Massachusetts, the subject of the movie Glory.
Right.
There are so many byways in this story. But back to William Stanley Hoole. He was the head of the Lost Cause Cluster at the University of Alabama and the University of Alabama Press. He had his own vanity press operation in downtown Tuscaloosa called the Confederate Publishing Company. He published a book called Alabama Tories. It's an important book because it's the first time anyone published the roster of the 1st Alabama. So that was a breakthrough. But he depicted them as untrustworthy hillbillies, using his term, who were interested only in making whiskey and stealing from rich plantation owners, which was the exact opposite of the truth. And he said, oh, by the way, Sherman took them on the march to the sea, but they didn't do anything important. So this was one of the great lies. Very important in my writing this book because in 1978, I heard about this book. Only 300 copies were published in 1961. And I got a rare book dealer in Atlanta to find it down, and it cost me $100 in 1978. But that book let me know that there was a real story here, and it took from that time until a few years ago to put the whole story together.
Well, now the story is told, and I think people will find your family history interesting. They will find the history, the story of the 1st Alabama Cavalry interesting, and they will be astonished at the shenanigans of archivists and historians. We are out of time. It has been
Thank you,
a pleasure.
It's great to see you again here on this campus that I love.
Thank you.